Northwestern University, where, what do you call it there, pop or soda?
Either one.
Either one. Either one works in Chicago.
Right.
Who's integral in the development of the NIH Toolbox, and is going to introduce you all to it. She's also going to be coming to each of your small groups to talk to you a little bit more. So we really won't have a lot of time to do questions at the end of this. We'll, hopefully you'll be able to cover those in your small groups. The small groups are scheduled to start in 15 minutes, which is not true. But the first set of small groups will be a little truncated so we can get back on track. But again, she's going to go through this high-level overview, and then we'll save your questions for when she's meeting with you directly. The one little quirk to this is that the last session of the day, groups 1 and 5 are going to meet together. And we can do that in the group 5 room, because I'm in group 5 and I know where my room is. So group 1, at the end of the day, will come to group 5's room for the last small group session. All right, with that, take it away.
Well, we're going to continue the theme of outcome measures, and I'm going to tell you about a group of outcome measures, the NIH Toolbox. So when you have decided on what outcomes you're going to measure, then you actually have to go ahead and select what you're going to use to measure. And some of the questions you're going to have in mind are, does that measure actually measure what I'm interested in? Is it a good measure? Is it valid and reliable? And also, what is the burden to using that measure or set of measures? So burden to the participant and burden to you in your study. So what are the costs? What are the training required? So I'm going to tell you about the NIH Toolbox, and I will address some of those questions, but not all of them, because this is a brief overview. I won't tell you in-depth psychometric information about all the measures, but I will show you, point you to some resources where you can get that information. The NIH Toolbox was created for you. It was funded by the NIH Blueprint for Neuroscience Research, and the idea was to have measures of important indicators of health and function that would be appropriate to use in a diverse types of studies with diverse populations. The idea was that these measures would be used across studies so that the NIH could then, or investigators could take that common data from all these studies and combine them or compare them. And if you use different measures for the same outcomes, you really have, it's a real barrier to comparing results. So the idea was that this would make it more easy to compare results and get more yield out of these studies. The toolbox covers 4 general domains of function. There are measures of cognition, measures of motor function, measures of emotional health and function, and measures of sensation. The final form of the toolbox is, there's actually 108 different instruments in the toolbox. So it's a fairly good set of tools that you could potentially use. It's arranged into 4 30-minute domain batteries. So 1 battery for cognition, 1 for motor, 1 for sensation, 1 for emotion. There are English and Spanish versions of all of the tests that are in the core batteries. Those core measures have been fully normed across the age span from age 3 to 85. And they were validated in general population samples. So there was validation that occurred. They are available on a single technology platform, which is important. You don't have to go switching back and forth. In addition to those 4 domain level batteries, there's 34 supplemental instruments that might be useful with particular groups or in particular situations. Supplemental instruments usually don't cover ages 3 to 85. That's one of the reasons they're supplemental. They aren't applicable across the age range. And then there are 10 measures that we began to develop, and then for other reasons we didn't continue development, usually because they weren't showing sufficient reliability or validity. But they are available for additional research. This is just an overview of development, so you can see the steps that we went through, and I'll tell you a little bit about each step. But as I said, I'm not going to give you detailed psychometric information, but you can judge by the methodology we used. The other thing I want to say that there were a lot of people involved in development of the toolbox, over 256 people across the United States. And they were organized into teams. So there was a group of cognition experts who developed the cognition measures. There was a group of motor experts. There were technology experts. There were statisticians and psychometricians. There were various working groups. So this was a really collaborative effort. And I also want to give the credit that the slides I'm presenting today were usually developed by somebody else. So these were, a lot of this information was presented in 2012 when we had a public conference on unveiling the toolbox. In addition to the network of people who were actually involved in the toolbox, we went out and asked for information from external experts. Again, like I said, the idea of the toolbox was to make it useful to you, to investigators. So we asked investigators, what do you want us to measure? And how do you want us to measure it? What kind of characteristics do you want in the instruments? So we did that through a request for information, and we also did more in-depth interviews with 44 experts. And as part of the whole development process, we tested over 20,000 different people. How did we decide on what to include in the toolbox? By that I mean the content, what to measure. We did a lit review, we did the request for information, expert interviews, and we all came together at a consensus meeting with NIH and then decided on what would we include. We couldn't include everything, so we had to prioritize. So the content of the toolbox were what everyone said were the most important things to measure. The other consideration was we wanted to measure things that were relevant across the lifespan. So one of the targets for the toolbox was large-scale epidemiological studies. So they were going to be, have enrolling subjects that cover the whole age range. It had to be significant to health and function, and it had to be measurable within practical constraints. After we decided what to measure, we had to select measures to do that. Again, we use the same sources of information, applicable across the age span. Intellectual property free. That was very important, and it was one of the sort of requirements of the contract. Because, as you know, if you've used measures that are proprietary, there's usually costs involved, and those costs can become prohibitive after a while. So we wanted intellectual property free, psychometrically sound measures that were easy to use, applicable, a variety of settings. We and the NIH preferred measures that were existing and met the criteria. Unfortunately, in most cases, we couldn't find a measure that covered all those criteria. So sometimes we had to develop new measures, or we modified existing ones. Modifications were usually things like, perhaps it was developed for children. Can we extend it to adults? Things like that. Also important in development was that we used both classical test theory and item response theory. And I'll tell you a little bit about item response for people who aren't familiar with it, and why it was important to use when we could use it. We also included reviews by particular working groups. Because it covered the age span, because it was supposed to be applicable to a variety of people, we wanted to make sure that any concerns for using it with geriatric populations was addressed, concerns about using it with children and how to use it with children, whether there were cultural aspects to some of the measures that we had to work at, how to make it accessible to people who have disabilities, and also whether the words we were using, the measures we were using, would be easily translated in the future. Although we did, as part of the contract, have a Spanish translation, we also had to think about were some of the language or some of the images, could they be applicable in other ethnic groups? After we did those things, developed the measures, we did field testing. And there were different types of field testing we did. Sometimes it was for feasibility. Was this measure, were these questions feasible to use with kids, for example? If we used IRT methods of item development, we had to calibrate the items. And again, I'll tell you a little bit about that when I talk about IRT. We validated measures against gold standards when they were available. And we also did evaluation of reliability, both internal consistency and test-retest reliability. We did a normative testing, so we recruited almost 5,000 subjects, English and Spanish, covered the age range 3 to 85. We did a 1-week retest with a subset of the sample, 500 participants. The sample was conducted at 10 different sites across the United States. It was conducted by a market research firm who did stratified random sampling to meet the requirements of the sample. So there were 100 different subjects in each of a single year age band from age 3 to 17, and then the adult bands were a little bit wider. It was census balanced by age, race, ethnicity, and education. So we tried to make it as representative of the U.S. population as possible. And we had separate English and Spanish speaking samples. The Spanish speaking was defined as people who preferred to be tested in Spanish. So they could be bilingual, but their preferred language was Spanish. One of the things we did discover that for a particular age group, about 7 to 18, once people reach school age, even though they might be bilingual or come from a Spanish-speaking family, they prefer to be tested in English. So for that particular age group, we don't have norms for the Spanish-speaking population. We also collected genetic material as part of the study and expanded norming of certain subsets. So we enlarged our pediatric population and also tested pregnant women as part of the sample. And that data collection was funded by the National Children's Study. So now let me diverge a little bit and say why did we want to use item response theory when we were doing test development? One of the things that IRT can enable is making assessments briefer. You can take a shorter measure and get as precise a score with an IRT-based measure as you can with a measure that's developed only with classical test theory. You need fewer items, and by items I mean questions as well as actual tasks. So I'm going to use items to refer to both. So the assessments can be briefer, they can be as precise, and you can adjust the precision. And the error in the score you get is understood at the individual person's level. And I'll talk more about that. And IRT allows you to build item banks. And item banks allow you to do computerized adaptive testing or short forms. I'll talk more about that. First, how does IRT differ from conventional test theory? When you build a measure using classical test theory, what happens, the person takes the measure, the assessment. Their score on that measure is used for comparison purposes. So they have to take the whole measure. If they get a high score, then the understanding is that the person is higher on the trait or whatever is being measured by that test or survey. If they get a low score, the understanding is that the person is lower on that trait, based on their score on the entire measure. In item response theory, each of the individual items can be used for comparison purposes. So you can look at an item, and it might be easiest to think about this in terms of achievement tests. So let's say you're measuring vocabulary. If a person gets correct a hard vocabulary item, so just that simple question, then you can assume that the person is higher in vocabulary ability based on their answer to that single item. If they get that item wrong, if they get the question wrong, then the person is lower on in vocabulary. And then what you can do is you can take these measures that measure the same construct and you can put them together into longer assessments that give you even greater precision than if you only get one single item. As I said, you can put these items together in an item bank. You can think of an item bank as a collection of items that measure a single construct. They can measure objective kinds of things like vocabulary, different kinds of cognitive function, but it can also be a construct that is more psychological, so depression. And what an item bank is that all the items are on a common metric. And you can think of it as a ruler. So on one end, you've got high, more difficult items, and the other end, you've got easier items. Or on one end, higher in the trait or lower in the trait. And then when you have this big bank of items, and it could be anywhere from 50 items or small as 10, you can take items from that item bank and construct the kind of measure that you want to construct in the sense of what level of precision you want, how long you want it to be. And once you have an item bank, you can do computerized adaptive testing. Probably everybody has been exposed to a computerized adaptive test, or CAT, if you've taken some of the educational kinds of tests. So what it is a computerized adaptive test. You have a whole item bank, and you take one question, and however you respond to that question, there is an algorithm behind the scenes that says, based on your response to that question, I'm going to give you the next question that will give me the most information based on your answer. So testing can be shorter if it's a CAT, and it can be more targeted. And I'll go through an example. So let's say you want to assess depression in somebody. You've got an item bank where one level is high depression, and the other level is low depression. Your participant comes and answers whatever question it is. Maybe it is, the question is, I get sad throughout the day. Based on the person's response to that, they are placed at that point on that ruler. That's where they're at. So what the computer says now, I'm going to give a question that will give me the most information in terms of where that person lies on the trait of depression. So it chooses to give a question within that particular range. So the range has now become narrower in terms of where you want to ask the question. You don't want to ask the question that is at the low depression end of the scale. So, for example, if the person had said, I'm never depressed, you wouldn't want to go on the high end of the scale, like, do you feel suicidal? Because they already said, I'm not depressed. You don't want to ask them about suicide. And neither would you want to give one on the lower end of the scale. So based on this next question, the person is there. So it says it's a little higher, a little more depression. You can do another question so that you can get even a narrower or more precise score. So the CAT algorithm would then say, let me take a question that is within that narrower range. I will give it to the person, and based on their response, I now know that the person scored right there. So you started out with a big range of items, a big area that the person could score in, and by the end of the CAT, in this case 3 questions, you have them more precisely placed on that ruler. I'm going to now give another demonstration with actual questions so you can get a sense of what would happen if a person took a pain interference measure. Now this measure is part of the toolbox. It's also part of other measurement systems. Can't see that very well, but that is what the item the item bank looks like. So those are all the questions in there. And this is what the person would see on their screen. A couple things I want you to pay attention to. So the CAT algorithm has a couple of different parameters it functions by, and some of those a person can preset, some are automatic. So the CAT, in this case, says that every participant is going to get a minimum number of 5 items. So everyone is going to get 5 items. The maximum number of items they're going to get is 20. So no more than 20, no less than 5. And the maximum standard error is 0.3. So that's the standard error on the person's score. So the CAT is going to keep giving questions to the participant until those parameters are met. So here is the first question that the person would get. In the past 7 days, how much did pain interfere with your day-to-day activities? Usually the first question in a CAT is based on either sort of the mid-range of the item bank, or in some of the achievement testing or cognitive testing, it's based on the person's education level or their age. So you want to start the person out at a place where they're likely to get, half the people are likely to get it correct, half the people are likely to get it wrong. So based on the person's response to this question, they get a score. In this case, the score is 60.6, and this is based on a range from 0 to 100, with 50 being the average. The standard error is 0.3, so the CAT has met the standard error criteria, but it has not met the criteria of giving 5 items to administer. So it gives another one. In this case, how much did pain interfere with your enjoyment of social activities? And the system, again, gives a score based on those 2 items, and the score is up in that red circle. Again, so the score is a little bit different. The standard error is a little bit more precise. It gives another question, and again, you get a score. The score again is a little bit different, but in the same range. And the standard error is even more precise. Item 5. You get a final score because it has met the requirement of 5 items with a standard error of no more than 0.3. So with just 5 questions on this pain interference CAT, you have gotten a precise score that you can use for an individual to compare the individual scores across time. Any questions before I leave this CAT demonstration? Yes.
So if it would have been, you would have given more questions had they said one was not at all and the next question was very much, if there had been a lot of variability within the first 5 questions that you asked?
There could be, depending on what the person answered. If the participant answers inconsistently, then the system will administer more items because it's trying to narrow that range. So if, they said, I'm not depressed, and then the next question they said, I cry all the time, the system would say, well, wait, this doesn't really make sense. So it'll, there will be more questions that have to be given in order to narrow the range.
So I guess that these kinds of metrics have been compared to traditional testing and been shown to be very similar in terms of the estimates that they provide across different.
Right. Usually
I know in my own field, some of our testing instruments are just really onerous. They take a long time to administer some of them. So it's just a real practical consideration sometimes.
Yes. And usually what happens if there's a comparison between an IRT-based measure and a measure that's been done on classical test theory, that you can get the same a score that is equally reliable with the classical measure, but you just need a lot more questions or a lot more items to give. So that's usually where the comparison is. You can measure the same thing in a shorter period of time. Any other questions? So this was the final score. All right, so back to the toolbox. When you think about the toolbox, think about the content, the tests themselves, what do they measure? And those are the core batteries and the supplemental measures. And then how are they given? And that's the sort of technology and the software administration part. The toolbox measures are currently given through something called Assessment Center. Assessment Center is another NIH resource. And it's really it's a software, it's a research management tool. And I'll describe it a little bit later. So back to the toolbox. There are 4, as I said, domain level batteries. And those domain level batteries are available in English and Spanish. Or if you're, the emotion battery comes in 2 versions. There's the self-report version, and then there's the parent report. So remember, if it's from 3 to 85, a 4-year-old is probably not going to be able to report on their emotional function. So for 3 to 7 and 8 to 12, there are proxy versions of those measures, parent report versions. And for motor, cognition, and sensation, there are also smaller batteries, sort of sub-batteries within those, the early childhood batteries. And those cover ages 3 to 6. Even though we tried to get measures that went all the way down, covered 3 to 85, in some cases we were not able to do that. So the 3 to 6-year-old usually don't include as many instruments, and they're shorter. So the domain batteries each takes about 30 minutes to administer. The early childhood versions take 20 minutes. The way it is set up in Assessment Center, when you choose a battery, the system automatically administers the age-appropriate version to the person. You don't have to pick the age-appropriate version. If you give the entire toolbox, the core batteries, it takes about 2 hours to administer. Yes?
Is it possible to have a surrogate do this, so people who might not be able to have the motor control to answer some of the emotion stuff, or so a caregiver could do it?
A caregiver, we didn't look at proxy. We didn't compare proxy versus participant. So we don't know how those scores compare. But yes, you could have a proxy or caregiver do it. Or you could have the caregiver answer, whatever the patient tells them to answer. We also tried to make some of the measures accessible by using, so the emotion measures are all, the way they're presented, they're all 503C compliant. So if a person has vision problems, they should still be able to take those measures. All of the toolbox instruments provide, each measure, each test gives a variety of scores. So there's age-adjusted and fully adjusted scores. There might be raw scores. There are none, except for cognition, there are no summary scores available. So you don't give the motor domain and get a motor score. You get a score on each of the individual tests of motor function. Cognition is the only one that provides more summary scores, and I'll describe them when I talk about cognition. An explanation of all the scores can be found in the scoring manual. So there's an NIH Toolbox scoring manual, explains scores, gives guidelines on what scores to use for a particular purpose, and it is available at the NIH Toolbox website. Now I'm going to go through each of the domain batteries to describe what is in each battery. So cognition has 6 different subcomponents, and within each of those subcomponents there are even more narrower constructs. So executive function, we assess, we have measures of executive function that evaluate inhibitory control and cognitive flexibility. There are 2 measures of language. We assess vocabulary comprehension and reading decoding. So this is the list of the measures in the core cognition battery. The ones that have an asterisk next to them are the ones that are also in the early childhood version. So you can see that one of the memory tests and the processing speed and the reading tests are not part of the early childhood battery. And if you add up the time of for each of the measures, it's about 33 minutes. So it's near our target of 30 minutes per battery. When I say 30 minutes, I mean that 90% of a general population sample should be able to finish the entire battery in about 30 minutes. I'm just going to give you a brief look at each of the tests. So, and I'm going to go through them in order that are actually presented in the toolbox if you were giving the entire core toolbox. So the first test a person sees is the picture vocabulary test. The task is that the computer says a word aloud, and for example, baby, and the participant has to choose the picture that best matches the meaning of that word. And so they would click on the picture that they see on the screen. This is a IRT-based test, so it's administered as a computerized adaptive test. There are several hundred vocabulary items. One participant will get no more than 25 or 30. Then it ends up taking about 4 minutes to get a good vocabulary score. After they get done with vocabulary, the next test that a person would see is the flanker test. And there are different versions of flanker tests out there. The idea behind this test is that the person is presented with a set of stimuli, in this case, fish. Younger participants, kids start with fish. Older participants get arrows. And the person has to decide whether the middle stimuli, either fish or arrow, is pointing in the same direction as the ones on either side. And then either indicate using their finger and a keyboard whether they are pointing in the same direction or in different directions. The way the test is scored is it is a combination of accuracy and reaction time. So, especially for if a person doesn't get a certain number of trials correct, they won't get the reaction time added onto it. But if they get them correct, then they get the sort of benefit of reaction time. It takes about 3 minutes to give this test. The next one in the battery is a working memory test. So it assesses how well a person can, for a short period of time, keep information in their short-term memory, manipulate it, and then hold the manipulation in the short-term buffer. This is somewhat of a challenging task. There are two kinds of items that the participant is presented with, either food or animals. They are given they see and hear a sequence of food or animals. So, for example, it might be the computer will say pumpkin, and they'll see a picture of pumpkin, and lemon, and then they'll see a picture of lemon. And if they and their task is to take what they saw and heard and then tell it back to you in size order from smallest to largest. And the sequence, the set of items, increases in terms of length so that it gets more difficult as time goes on. They first have to do this with only getting presented the same sort of item. They see either all food or all animals. Then after they get through that, they are presented with a mixture of it. So they will see some food and some animals. And then they have to take those stimuli and tell them back to you in size order, first food, then for animals. So it can get challenging as time goes on. And the score is the total number correct. This one is one of the longer tests. It takes about 7 minutes to get. Then they get a executive function, another executive function test where they have to sort stimuli by color, then shape, and then shift according to the instructions. So they have to, match on color. They're presented with, trucks. It's very simple stimuli, and they have to say whether, based on what that particular characteristic they're looking for, whether the stimuli are the same or different. After that, they get a processing speed test, and this test measures how long it takes to process a set amount of information. They're presented with two stimuli, and they have to decide as quickly as they can whether they are the same or different. This is a short test. It takes about 90 seconds. For everybody, it's 90 seconds, and it's really how many they've gotten correct within that period of time. The next test is another memory test, and this is a fun test. If you see a demo of it, it's an attractive test. I think it's fun. The computer presents them with a set of pictures in a certain sequence. Then the computer messes up the pictures, and the person has to put them in the same sequence as they saw them in. The length of the sequence depends on the person's age. So for younger people, they get shorter sequences, like 6 steps. And then once you reach 7 years old, you are presented with much longer sequences. So the first one you get is 15 pictures, and then you get 18 pictures. Yes?
So I'm just curious, in all these tests, is there like a validity measure that might pick up if somebody is not trying or they misunderstood directions? Or is there a way to...
No, there is no validity measure. For each of these tests, there's usually a practice sequence. So if the person doesn't get past the practice, usually kids or some other cognitive problem, then you don't give them the test. But if someone is deliberately faking, that is not something. We don't have that as part of the toolbox measures. You could add it on, but we don't have it as part of that. The last cognition test is oral reading recognition. So the computer presents the person with either a letter or a word, a single word, and they have to say it aloud to you. So if it's a letter, they have to name the correct letter. If it's a single word, they have to read it aloud. And the examiner scores whether they have pronounced it correctly. So it's really, how well, it's really reading, it's not understanding. It's a cat, and so it usually takes about 30 items before you reach the precision that you want. It takes about 3 minutes. There are also a couple of supplemental measures in cognition for 8 to 85. One is another episodic memory test, or an auditory verbal learning test, and then there's another measure of processing speed. These can be useful in situations like for if a person is visually impaired and you want to test verbal learning, you can give them the auditory verbal learning test. Or if a person is motor impaired and you want to assess processing speed, you can give them oral simple digit test. As I said, cognition gives composite scores. You get a fluid composite and you get a crystallized composite if you give all the tests that make up that composite. You also get a total composite, a total cognition score. Before I go on to emotion, any other questions about cognition? Yes?
Are these tests all done on a computer?
Yes, they are.
How does a test adjust for like people who are older who are not familiar with computers?
There's usually a practice session where you have the person, even an older person, use the computer, and then in each individual test there are instructions saying that for this particular test it's okay for the participant to say the answer, and the administrator to give the response. So for that vocabulary test where you've got to click on the picture, if the person can't use the mouse or doesn't want to use the mouse for whatever reason, it's okay for the administrator to, to point and click. Yes?
How often can you repeat tests? Or what frequency?
We were only able to do 1 week retest. So the question being, what are the practice effects? We don't have any reliable sort of change indices that would allow an examiner to say how much is a change on this score due to practice or to an actual real change. The IRT-based measures like the vocabulary and reading, because the person may not see the same stimuli each time, because remember the cat chooses stimuli based on the response, they may be less susceptible to practice effects. And then the picture sequence memory test, that's the one where you have to arrange the pictures in particular order. There are 3 alternate versions of that. So the computer automatically gives a certain version the first time you test someone, a different version the second time, and a different version the third time. So that also can minimize some of the practice effects.
And that's based on each, so like, if I took it, I got picture set 1, and somebody else took it, they got picture set 2. It would,
no, it's based on the person. So yeah, and if it's set up in such a way that the computer knows it's the same person each time, like if you have an ID for that participant, it will automatically give a different version of that test each time.
Is there a fatigue effect for this? Like using a 2-hour battery versus a 30-minute battery?
It can be. It's okay to give breaks within tests, and it's okay to give, for us, breaks between batteries. You don't have to give each battery also. You can give 1 battery. In most of the tests, you can stop within a test, and as long as you do the proper stuff on the computer, when you come back, it'll take you back to the same point in that test. One of the exceptions is that processing speed, that 90-second test, because it's only 90 seconds long. If you stop in the middle of it, you're basically done. All right, emotion. Emotion is all self or participant report, or participant report or parent report. The other batteries are really more performance tests. So within emotion, we have measures of psychological well-being, social relationships, stress and self-efficacy, and negative affect. And within each of those, there are smaller clusters of measures. For example, psychological well-being, we have measures of positive affect, life satisfaction, meaning, and purpose. Again, you can either, for this particular set of measures, you can pick either self or parent report or both. As I said earlier, the system automatically gives the age-appropriate versions. So there are versions for 18 and over, 13 to 17. For the 8 to 12-year-olds, there's self and parent report. And for 3 to 7-year-olds, there's only parent report. All of these measures were developed or in many cases, they were existing measures which were modified to be consistent with the other toolbox measures using IRT. So they are often as a computerized adaptive test. Occasionally they may be short forms. Short forms are usually fixed length, anywhere from 4 to 8 items. And then there are also supplemental emotion measures, which became supplemental usually again because they don't cover the age range. I'm not going to go into the emotional health measures because there's over 100 of them if you consider every age version a separate measure. But you can learn about them either on the website. And also, at the back of the room, I brought some toolbox brochures which go, again, go over the measures.
Can I just a brief question in general about them?
Yeah.
It seems like with the questions that are being asked, the patient has to have some degree of capacity for insight? Is there some kind of baseline threshold of saying the person has enough abilities to be able to proceed with this domain?
When we did our norming, our eligibility criteria was that the person was able to provide informed consent. We felt they could truly provide informed consent, and we felt they could take the toolbox.
Right.
So it's pretty broad, but that's what we used. All right. For motor, we have measures of dexterity, strength, balance, locomotion, and endurance. So there are 5 tests within the core battery. Again, if you give the entire battery, it takes about 30 minutes. The early childhood battery includes all of those except for locomotion. We just could not get these young kids to walk consistently for 4 meters. So the first measure in the motor battery is a pegboard dexterity test. We test both hands. We get 1 practice and 1 test trial per hand. And the task is to put the pegs in the pegboard and then take them out, and we time it. And that's really the score. The raw score is time to complete 1 trial. And it is a generic piece of equipment that you can buy through different vendors. And actually for the motor test, you don't even really need the computer. You could give all these measures and then put the scores into the computer at a different point in time. So all you need is a stopwatch and some of the equipment. Strength, we use a grip dynamometer. Again, it is a fairly standard piece of equipment. You may have seen other dynamometers. We chose a particular model. Test both hands. They get 1 practice and 1 test trial per hand. And the raw score is their grip force in pounds. Balance, we have a standing balance test. This uses an accelerometer and Bluetooth to measure postural sway. The participant has to assume 5 different standing conditions. And they are different positions. It's standing like this and doing the same thing with your eyes closed, standing on a foam pad, and standing within a tandem gait. If a person misses one with closed eyes, I believe that the system doesn't give them any more positions where they have to close their eyes. So a lot of this has to do with safety, because if the person falls, there could be a safety problem. There is no raw score with this because it's a wave function, and you get a computed score in the score output. Our test of locomotion is a 4-meter gait speed test. It's based on an already existing protocol. They do the walk for 4 meters 2 times at their usual pace. And the score is their time in seconds to walk 4 meters at the usual pace. And the computer takes the best score out of those 2 trials and uses it to provide a normal score. Endurance test is a 2-minute walk test. It's adapted from an existing 6-minute walk protocol. The score is the distance in feet and inches walked in 2 minutes. As part of the test development, the motor team looked at how does the 6-minute walk compare to the 2-minute walk, and the correlations were so high, like 0.98, and it was reliable enough that we felt that for Toolbox you could do the 2-minute walk instead of doing the 6-minute walk. Any questions about motor? I'll go on to the last domain. All right, sensation. We test 6 aspects of sensation: smell, taste, balance, hearing, somatic sensation, and vision. And within each of those, there are sometimes more than one measure to test that same component. The core battery has 6 different measures in it. The early childhood only contains 3 measures. So we have a measure of pain, a measure of smell, visual acuity, dynamic visual acuity, which is a vestibular measure, a words and noise test, and a taste intensity test. The pain measure are existing measures, which were adapted for use in the toolbox. Only adults get the pain measures. One is a intensity measure on the visual analog scale. The other is the pain interference survey, which you saw, which was used during the CAT demonstration I gave you. So pain interference just asks how much pain interfered in a person's daily life. Odor identification test is given using scratch and sniff cards. Children are asked to identify those 5 different smells. The adults get all of those smells, plus coffee smoke, natural gas, and flour. And what the person does is they are given a card, they scratch it, they sniff it, they have 4 pictures in front of them, and they have to click on the picture that they think best matches what they smelled. Our measure of taste is a taste intensity test, so it's not whether they can identify a particular taste, but how intense it seems to them. It's only given to ages 12 and up, not that we don't think younger kids can taste, but because the response scale is this generalized linear magnitude scale that you see from strongest imaginable to barely detectable, and that can be kind of difficult to use. So taste intensity is only given for to 12 and up. Our measure of visual acuity is very similar to what you would see in a physician's office or an optometrist's office. They are presented with different letters, and they have to identify what letter they see. The 3 to 6-year-olds get only 4, H, O, T, V, or O. 7 and above get different symbols. We test both eyes simultaneously. We ask the participant to wear, if they use eyeglasses or contacts, we want them to wear those. We're not interested in, the toolbox wasn't interested in their sort of actual visual acuity, but really normal function. So if they have anything that corrects their vision, they should wear it. The dynamic visual acuity follows right after our visual acuity test, and this is a measure of vestibular function. So what happens based on the participant's performance on visual acuity, the dynamic visual acuity starts at that sort of same acuity level. So you need to give static visual acuity in order to get a dynamic visual acuity test. So the task basically is that the person is shaking their head, and once they reach a certain rate of shaking, a letter will appear on the screen, and they have to identify that letter. One of the things for the 2 vision test, though, you need a large room because the person has to be 12 feet away from the screen. So that is something.
I'm just like, that sounds like fun.
Yeah, it's, and you don't give it to people who have any neck problems. You don't give it to people who get dizzy with that kind of thing. Hearing test, we have a word in, our measure of hearing is words in noise. We do not have a measure of hearing perception or hearing thresholds. We did try to develop one, but it ended up not being reliable enough at certain frequencies. So the current measure of hearing in the toolbox is the words and noise test. It's an existing measure. And what happens, the participant is wearing headphones and they hear words presented in the context of background noise that rises in intensity as the test progresses. So it starts out, it's pretty easy at the beginning to hear the word, and then if they continue, it gets very difficult to hear the word, at least for some of us. A couple of supplemental sensory measures. There's a quality of life measure related to vision, and then there's hearing handicap inventory. Both of these are self-report or a proxy report, and have to do with how hearing or vision problems may have impacted their quality of life. All right, so that's the toolbox. Now, assessment center. Toolbox resides in assessment center. You need to use assessment center to give a lot of the tests. As I said, not necessarily motor. You could give the motors outside that. And the emotion. The emotion ones you could give on paper and pencil. You can give by paper and pencil if you wanted to, because they're questionnaire forms. Assessment Center was also funded by the NIH. In its creation, it's a research management tool. What it does, if you go on Assessment Center, you can create study-specific websites. So it was begun for patient-reported outcomes, so that a participant could go to that study website and answer the questionnaires using that website. So they did not have to come into a testing center. They could do it anywhere that they had access to a computer. There's the participant interface. Yes?
Can any of this be done on a tablet?
Good question. I will get to that. The self-report measures outside of Toolbox. So within Assessment Center, there are other publicly available measures. PROMIS, Patient-Reported Outcome Measurement Information System. All of the PROMIS measures are in Assessment Center. NeuroQual, which are quality of life measures for people with neurological disorders, are also in Assessment Center. A lot of those measures can be given on a tablet. Toolbox measures are not yet able to do on a tablet. The other thing is Assessment Center, because it's a research management tool, if you set up your study in Assessment Center, you can set it up to have multiple time points, different arms. It has a lot of potential Assessment Center, but it's also not necessarily easy to use. Again, it's multiple study arms. You can randomize non-toolbox instruments in Assessment Center. You can track accrual. One thing Assessment Center does do for all of the measures within it are to give you a real-time data export. You can request the data exports, and those exports separate protected health information from the actual test data. It also gives you an automated data dictionary. If you want to get the toolbox, then you really need to get both of those components. There are two steps to getting the toolbox. One is to request access to the test from the NIH Toolbox website, and you follow the link that says, how do I access the NIH Toolbox measures? Now, the reason you can't just publicly, go to Assessment Center, and if you go to Assessment Center, you're a registered user, you'll see PROMIS measures, you'll see NeuroQual measures. You won't see the Toolbox measures. And the reason you won't see them is really to protect the content of the tests, especially cognition. You can imagine if anybody could get on Assessment Center and see all the vocabulary words, they could potentially practice them. So we want to protect the content of the tests. That's why we have this two-step process. So you need to be a registered Assessment Center user, and you need to request access to the toolbox. Once you've gotten that, you do need there are certain requirements, other requirements to using the toolbox. Currently, you need an internet connection, and we recommend a good internet connection to avoid connectivity problems, so probably lots of wireless doesn't work. There are specific hardware and materials used for some of the tests. For motor, you saw that you need a pegboard, grip dynamometer. There are certain software requirements and browser and computer requirements. And all of those are listed on the NIH Toolbox website. You need the manuals. You should have an administration. The administration manual gives the basic kinds of instructions that your administrator can use. And that's also available on the website. We highly recommend training, depending on what you're going to give. If you're only giving the emotion measures, training requirements are much less. But if you're giving cognition measures, motor sensation, we recommend either in-person training, which we don't currently have any scheduled, but we also will come out to a site if needed. And you can also learn how to give the measures using the e-learning modules which are on the Toolbox website. We also suggest that you are familiar with Assessment Center and how to set things up in Assessment Center. There are a fair number of resources to help you give the toolbox. So on the website, we have the different manuals, e-learning. We have guidelines on reasonable accommodations. For example, like if somebody has low vision, what tests can you still give that we think in a valid fashion while also accommodating the visual handicap. The Toolbox website is the contact point for getting access, for requesting norming data. If you want norming data for some purpose, you can request it and give it to you, and to get scientific help. The Assessment Center website contains a lot of information about Assessment Center, tutorials on how to use Assessment Center manual. You can also send questions to get help with the Toolbox and Assessment Center. With 3 primary references to learn about the psychometrics of the measures. There's a neurology supplement. There is a supplement to the monographs, the Society for Research in Child Development, that describes the cognition measures for children. And then there is a series on the cognition battery in the Journal of International Neuropsychological Society, which was just recently published. In the future, so original contract was done in 2012. There's been continuing development. Currently, we're updating the browser. One of the more difficult things about the Toolbox is the technology and software requirements. Current browser is, I think, IE 8 or 9, and a lot of people don't use Internet Explorer 8 or 9. So we're updating to IE 11, and that should be done at the end of this year. In the meantime, on the website, we say how to go into compatibility mode. If you try using IE 11, for the emotion measures, it should work fine. For the cognition measures, what may happen, you might not even notice it, but the timing may be off. It might not look the same. It might not be recording the scores. So it may look like it's working, but in actuality, it may not. We are developing, as part of the National Children's Study effort, a tablet version, an iPad version. One of the requests that end users have made saying, I don't have internet. I can't use this system. So the iPad version will address that. It can be given offline. It's also going to decrease the equipment requirements because for a lot of the tests, they're dual screen. So you need a laptop and you need a screen. But the iPad version is going to be an iPad and a very simple maybe iPhone or smaller tablet for the examiner. So that's going to simplify the equipment needs. We're going to release enhanced norms, hopefully in the next year. Change indices will hopefully come up so that an examiner can look at practice effects. And then costs. So currently, except for equipment costs, there are no costs to use the Toolbox. If you go on the website, you will see, though, that these costs have been waived through December 2014. After that time, there may be costs to using it. And the reason there are costs is having to do with this, keeping it up to date. It's not like no one is making a profit off of this, but you need resources to, update browsers, deal with software issues, technology issues, so there may be costs. There's some ballpark estimates on the website. The iPad version with a different cost structure. It might be per user, it might be per installation. It's not clear yet. All right, questions?
So maybe we'll defer questions.
Oh, that's right.